welcome everyone to our last luncheon for 2021. We made it. Woohoo! Right? Looking forward to 2022 already. That's hard to believe. I'm going to let Bruce give you guys a howdy this morning right off the bat. How's that sound?
Hi, I'm Bruce Hilligeist, President of the Chamber. So glad to see all of you here. Good group today, Jeremy. Thank you so much for speaking to our group. Most people in Tomball think that I'm really good with names, but I'm not. I'm really not. You know, Elizabeth, hi. We just met. I just met a lot of people, but many times I'm so interested in knowing about Elizabeth that I'm really not hearing her name. Before I stopped speaking, I can't remember her name, but I did this time. And so we're so glad that Jeremy's here today to kind of talk to us about that. We need to do more listening. And many times it is true that we need to hold our tongue and do more listening than talking, number one. But just do more, listening to and hear what is being said. People like to know, people like their name, and that's just important to me to be able to do that. I'm not as good as you think I am, but I did remember Elizabeth today. So it's all about relationship building and whatnot. Communication is very important in all of our lives, and so we're so glad that you could be here today because we're going to all learn together. We're going to learn in this life and live and have fun today and eat a good meal. So we're so thankful that you can be with us, and welcome.
All right, well, one of the reasons that we're able to gather here is because Pastor Greg Jenkins and his staff have just so graciously opened their doors. When we decided that we wanted to move forward in 2021 and offer these lunches, and the college wasn't open yet, then we had to find a place. And so we're just so very thankful. And I've asked him to come and, again, welcome us today and then open us in prayer, if you don't mind.
Appreciate all that you do and just love our community, and really grateful to just have a small part in this, and so welcome. And if you don't already know, the restrooms are out those double doors, and you go around to the left and you'll see the restrooms there. That's important information to know when you're in a new place perhaps. And so y'all pray after you eat. Is that?
Well, can you bless? We already ate.
You already ate.
But you can bless that.
So we say, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, right?
I want to tell you a little bit about the organization. So the Greater Tomball Area Chamber of Commerce, we are the Health and Wellness Committee. That's a committee within the chamber, and we put this luncheon together. And our members are all chamber members. We attend meetings regularly, and we have several different areas of focus. And one of them is to provide these community lunches, and we try to bring in experts within their fields that are giving you guys some great information. And then we do Tomball night, and we do some blood drives as well. The reason that we're able to have a luncheon that is free for you is because we have an amazing lunch sponsor, and that's Tomball Regional Health Foundation. And so I'm going to ask Marilyn Kinman to come up and just say a few words. She's always so excited to do this.
My favorite thing to do. Welcome everybody. We're so glad you could make it out today. We're so grateful that we can help in the community and partner with people like the Chamber. We've been around for 10 years as a foundation now. Before that, we owned the hospital. We give to the medical needs in the community, the health and wellness, and we're just glad to be here and help everybody. And go Stros.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, and we already have recognized Tomball Assembly of God Church, which is where we're sitting today. I also want to make sure that we point out Miss Jonetta, B Productions. She's just done a fabulous job. So this is actually being recorded. And Jonetta, it will be available on your website, is that correct?
We're going to put it up on YouTube, either mine or the Chamber.
So that way you kind of know where that is, and we'll make sure that you have links available for that. So thank you. She donates her time and does that for us, and so we're super appreciative. Can you guys give her a round of applause, please? Thank you. Before I introduce our featured businesses, I do want to thank Mr. Kent Klingerman with Precinct 4. If you guys will give him a round of applause, we're always glad to have our officials in with us. I appreciate that. And then we do have some featured businesses towards the back, and I want to introduce each of them. So we have Troy Williams with the Oasis Senior Advisors. Troy. We have the Juice Bus Company, who is Miss Kim Pedicini is back there with us today. And then my new friend, Miss Danielle Endress. How'd I do? Good? Awesome. With Grand Canyon University. So if you have not had a chance to visit with them before you sat at your table, please take time after Jeremy gets through speaking and visit with them, because they came here to actually tell you a little bit about what they do and just get to know you better. So please take time to do that. Oh my gosh, look what's next. Let me tell you a little bit about Jeremy before he comes up. Let me make sure I did everything. I think I did. Yes, all right. Jeremy. So, you know how there are a couple of times I've actually been in the room where Jeremy, we were at the same meetings. And all of a sudden, towards the end of the meeting, there's this big group of people. And at the center of the group of people, guess who's there? Jeremy. Right? Because he has an interesting story and he loves to educate. And so after it happened the second or third time, I'm like, I want to hear what he's having. I want to hear what he has to say. And so once I understood what he had to share with us, I invited him to come to our Health and Wellness Committee, and they almost didn't let him out of the room. I mean, it was one of the longest meetings we've had. As a result of that, Cody's like, I'm bringing my whole staff to hear this, right? So we're really excited to have him here with us today, and I know that you guys are in for a real treat. So Jeremy Angus has been legally blind from a very young age due to high fever spikes. He's always struggled with grade school, and he eventually dropped out of college, got married, and started his own video game LAN, which I didn't, LAN Center. It's like an arcade, he says. But the combination of getting married, having kids, starting a business, all at the age of 20. Can you guys think back to when you were 20? It proved to be overwhelming, and he sold the company. He worked for his family tax business for a few years, and then he went back to school where he received his graduate degree in school psychology and worked as a licensed specialist in school psychology for 5 years. Working within the school district led Jeremy to explore more about how companies run, how communication breakdowns affect productivity, and ultimately how we can work to improve our approach to business and other human relationships. Armed with this knowledge and experience, he left the school system and again joined his family in business and was instrumental in taking Guardian tax service from a local preparer to a nationwide remote back office and consultation firm called Guardian Business Group. Jeremy's diverse background mixed with psychology training has helped him to become a service coordinator capable of communicating between business owners and the vendors they work with. He's been focused on developing his network in both business development and mental health awareness, and endeavors to use his resources to help others with disabilities either find meaningful work or create their own using their unique skill sets and perspectives. So please extend a warm welcome to Jeremy. We're really excited to have him here.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you so much for the intro. It's nice to see you guys. Well, she said I'm legally blind, so public speaking is actually not nervous-wracking for me. No, I'm not going to go away. Don't worry. I've got a spot over here. So one of the things we do in psychology is really important, and anytime you're communicating with another person is also important, is called operational definitions. It's where you give a definition of the topic you're about to talk about, so you know that you're actually talking about the same thing. So as far as communication, what we're looking at today is the imparting or exchanging of information or news. Real simple. That's what the official definition of communication is, so keep that in mind while we're going through this process. So this presentation is to help kind of draw the idea of why there's so much arguments going on. I'm actually really proud of my son because I was helping me put this together, and he's 17, and he turned to me and goes, you know, I noticed that a lot of arguments, a lot of adult problems would go away if people just asked for clarification. I was like, boom, don't forget that. Because we become emotional. And I have a really good story for that. I'll explain something that happened recently. But the biggest thing about it is that, let me see, flip through it. I like this quote a lot because it makes so much sense. I mean, basically any language is a dead language until somebody else is willing to hear you. Because the biggest thing to remember as we go through this, and it's a hard, really hard thing for people to understand, because I've had this conversation a lot. I've done it in business, I've done it with schools, I've done it with churches, and you have to remind people, language is made up. We weren't given language, we developed it. We started to point at things. Then when you study etymology, when you look back at the history of words, you're like, where does that word come from? One that I realized recently that was one of my favorite origins of words is the word Arctic. It's Greek for bears. So Antarctic is Greek for no bears. That's, now you know the difference between those two regions. There's a lot of hilarious things with language that's just like, wait, what? And it's because we made all this up. And if you don't believe that language is made up, then look up how many there are. If language was something that just came innately to human beings, we'd all have the same one. And what happens is when you're raised in a certain language, your brain tells you other languages are incorrect. That's so strange that you make this noise different than mine. When your language is 5,000 years old, as mine's 300, you know? It's like, and it becomes a weird thing because the world we live in, we are taught to translate everything through language. There's language in advertising. Every time you pick up your phone, every time you turn on the news, you're bombarded by language. So your brain says, okay, reality must be language-based. When it really isn't. Language is what we use to describe reality. It's not what we use to create it. All right, so this is what it takes to have a conversation. And you guys get access to these slides. There's no real point in me going into all of this. The only reason I listed it is because this took me a long time to cut down. All right, this is all the things involved. There's over 100 muscles. Every time I think of the next thing I'm going to say, even in giving a presentation, and I'm in Toastmasters with Jonetta, and I've been learning, because we get nervous whenever we stop. That quiet freaks people out when you're the speaker, so we fill it. We go, you know, like if I could just keep a noise going, then I'm still communicating. It makes us feel like we're doing something. You know, it's why one of the reasons people put in filler words. But all of this is happening just when you want to say one thing. You have to think about it. It turns a thought, which is an electrical impulse, into words. You're like, okay, well, this emotion is this word, and this emotion is this word. You put it in order, and then you send signals to 100 different muscles that all coordinate. Your lips, your tongues, your chest. It pushes air out, and you shake the air, which shakes the air, because you have air all around you. Right now, because I'm using a microphone, these are pumping in, and they're shifting the air like water. You're pushing waves. And those waves are hitting each one of your ears and bending little hairs. And your brain goes, well, if the hair bends this way, that's an E sound. So all it takes, because it goes through memory first, all it takes is for you to be upset with somebody. And you just say, you hear everything. Best example I can give of that was when I was working in the schools. When we come in to do behavioral observations on a child, it takes us about 5 seconds to figure out which kid we're there for. And I saw this kid, he's sitting on his desk and says sitting in the chair. And the teacher's like, all right guys, this is what we're gonna do today. And she's writing on the table, and then you hear him go, hey, what are we doing today? And she goes, would you just let me do my job, please? Just stop it. And went back to writing. And I caught on that he wasn't being rude. So I made a note of it. I'll talk to her after class, because that was a weird exchange. So when I was talking to her, I was like, hey, when Johnny asked what was going on, I know you just said what was going on, but he may not have heard you. And she's like, well, you heard the way he said it. What are we doing next? And I was like, that's really interesting, because he didn't say it like that. And she argued with me about it. She was like, no, that's what I heard. And I was like, well, this is the problem. When you hear the word, but you don't get the visual interpretation, it goes through memory first. So when you hear Johnny's voice, what does he usually sound like? And she's like, that doesn't make sense. So I was like, well, let's try it again. So she noticed when she would turn away from him, his voice would change. He would sound a lot more snooty and snotty if she wasn't looking at him, because her brain was like, oh, that's Johnny. This is what he sounds like. Play file number 4. It's audio files, like on your computer, right? So like I said, the biggest thing to remember is that this is a very, very complex process that can go wrong at any point. And so the best way to explain it, and again, this is a cool little visual if you're curious to see kind of how the brain processes language. We're going to go through this, each step, real simply, but I'm going to compare it to shipping a package, because it just makes more sense. You know, I didn't come to teach neurobiology and like how the brain works and all that. You just need to really understand what's happening, like what I'm doing right now. So, I will use myself as an example. I have an idea. That's how it starts. My idea is, ooh, I learned about all this stuff and I'd love to share it with people. That'd be fun. And so while I'm sitting here, I'm sorting through all this data and information and things I've practiced and other times I've given a speech, jokes that fell flat that I'm just gonna put over here, and then jokes that might work and I'll test them out. So the idea is I'm forming an idea, which means I'm looking for something to ship. I wanna ship this potted plant to my mother. And you know, she lives in Phoenix, for instance. Let's say she's in Phoenix. And, actually, it was where my dad is, so I'm gonna send him a plant and confuse him, because I don't know why you would accept a plant, but the idea is, I have an idea. So now, I have to do what's called encoding. That's what I'm talking about. That's where you're actually fitting thoughts. You know, these amalgamous emotional thoughts, you're shoving them into words based off English. English is a good language. It's way more detailed than, let's say, ancient Aramaic or, you know, Greek. It's got a lot more descriptions because we have more things, which tricks us into thinking we're more advanced than every human that's ever been because we have more words, which actually just causes more stress. But it's because we have like 50 different types of chairs now, right? And we have like 30 different types of shirts and like 100 different types of phones. So we've had to add more language. So we've gotten more and more specific as we've developed as a culture. So now I'm looking at this and I need to encode this, which means I need to make sure that I put it in the right type of box, right? So if I put this into a box by itself, it's not gonna make it. So I need to think to myself, okay, so I gotta make sure I put the right packing material, I gotta protect this because it's glass, right? And if I ship this wrong, and there's a plant in it, so I gotta be careful. So what I'm doing here is I'm thinking, what languages do I use? If I got up here and just started swearing and using like vulgarity, I guarantee by this audience, it's probably a little like, okay, cool, Assembly of God, good job, Jeremy. You really thought that one through, didn't you? But it makes a huge difference who you're talking to, where you're at, what the topic is about. You know, you don't use humorous language at a funeral, like, oh, this is a nice day for a funeral. You know, and you'd say stuff like that, people are like, well, obviously you wouldn't do that, but there's a lot involved in that. And people who don't have good social skills, such as people with autism or people who don't socialize a lot, they don't get that. So they'll say really rude things, and you just assume they're being mean or being rude, but really it's just that they just encoded it wrong. So now you gotta pick the method. All right, so there's a channel. So I'm obviously decided to do this presentation verbally. It just makes more sense. I could have just stood up here and pointed at the slides, but most of you guys would be like, all right, I'm gonna go back to my lunch and network. It's not interesting. But verbal communication is good because it's a conversation. I'm having a conversation with multiple people in the room and doing my best to engage each person. So I'm using a microphone to do that. I could just yell out, but then, oh, wait, actually I picked it up. But the idea is using the mic helps you guys understand it more, makes it more clear, helps you really, you know, trying my best to make sure that the message gets across. The visual helps as well, that adds to it. But that's where also, now we have so many different channels. We used to only have verbal, then we had written. Now we have texting and email. And I don't know if people do singograms anymore, if that's a thing, but that used to be a thing, right? But the idea is, it's really important. You know, you don't want to text to somebody and be like, oh, hey, by the way, you know, you're fired. Like, that's not a good way to handle that. That's probably something that should be done one-to-one, right? But people nowadays choose this texting method the most. I think everybody here would agree that text has become probably the most dominant form of communication that we use, which also includes like Facebook Messengers, leaving comments kind of thing. That's very text-like. So again, what can go wrong? This is, you remember, all the steps that just happened was just me getting the package ready, right? So what if I'm not good at packaging, which people can be, right? What if I don't put my words in the right order? What if I don't allow a pause long enough for you to actually get the message? And sometimes we do that, especially if we're nervous. We're just and it's like, okay, I don't get this. What's really interesting when you study human language, if you talk to people, if you don't speak Spanish and you hear a group of people speaking Spanish, it sounds like they never take a breath. And I hear that. People are like, how do you just talk like crazy? But if you talk to people who don't speak English, listening to people who speak English, they say the exact same thing. Because we don't take a breath. If you listen to somebody and try to ignore the words, you'll notice your brain is making those sentences. Now, I'm training as a professional speaker, so I do put pauses in because I'm trying to make sure I don't just keep talking. But in regular conversation, listen to yourself. You don't speak in sentences. You throw out data and their brain does it for you. So that process can go wrong if you're just adding too much. And that's one of the things I do because I do parent training and also work with employees. Anybody time you're having communication, just remember, the more words, the higher rate of misunderstanding. That's it. The more language you give another human being, they are sifting through more things. So it just, by default, just by statistics, you're gonna have a higher chance, especially if you're talking to a 5-year-old. I used to work at a pre-K, and I'd see these people like, you really should be careful, because when you do this, and he's just like, got it, okay. All I heard was hit my sister, like, so I guess that's what I'm gonna do next. And it does, their brain, the best way to describe it, the younger people are, and even adults, people don't realize the short-term memory can handle 7 plus or minus 2, which is the weirdest statistic ever, but basically 5 to 9 things. That's why we had to break phone numbers down into chunks. 281, 255, 2929. That's not, 3, 6, 10 words? It's not 10 numbers, it's 3 numbers. That's what chunking is. So when you talk to somebody, if you use more than 9 words in a single sentence, they probably lost one. Because it's like that old game where you take the napkin and you put marbles on it until it shatters. You guys remember that game, Break the Ice? I don't know if anybody ever played that, but you add a marble, and whoever adds the last marble, it all falls, all the marbles are gone. So these are all things that can go wrong. You could package it wrong, you could use the wrong information. It's so easy to mess up the encoding process. Like I said, if I put this in the wrong packaging. So this is what's important. I have shipped my message. I have given you guys verbal communication. At this point, I've given you guys a lot of words. What percentage of the communication I'm giving you, not my hand gestures, not my facial expressions, not my emotional, just the words alone. Anybody know the statistic? 10%? That's pretty good. Most people guess around 50, right? 50 or 60. It's 20. This is why texting is awful. Texting and driving is worse than drinking. You are better off being legally intoxicated than you are checking your phone. And the reason for that is because if I pick up my phone and I see a text message from a friend that says, hey, you want to go to the movies tonight? My brain immediately takes that information and adds the other 80%. Where they are, what they look like, what they're wearing, who they're with. So my brain goes off into running this simulation of the other 80% because I want to know the whole communication. Meanwhile, I've just rear-ended somebody. And this is why, the best example I can give of this, everybody's probably been in this situation. You go on a date, or you're out with your wife or your husband, and the night goes great. You guys just have a good night. There's no problems, there's no complaining, you just have a good dinner, and you go to see a movie, and you get up the next day, you're getting ready, you go to work, and you're sitting in your office, you're like, all right, today will be a good day. And you get a text, like, oh, and you look. What are you doing? You're like, oh, they're thinking about me. What a good feeling that is, that somebody's thought about me, and thank you. Then we reverse the situation, right? Bad night. Everybody, you're sitting at dinner, you're not talking. Kind of, everybody, it's a bad mood. Stroh's lost. The energy's all off, right? Everything's bad. Well, this was years ago. This was years ago. Old Strohs. No. So you get the message, and you're at work. And what are you doing? Your first instinct is like, it's none of your business. I don't know why you're checking up on me. Right? And what's funny is human beings, they have one intent, right? You can't have like 4 or 5 different intents. You have one. There's one intent. And sometimes if you're with a sneaky person, you're trying to figure people out, we can try to guess, they mean this, this is. But your perspective, you got 20% of what they're trying to tell you. And you made up the other 80 based off your emotions, your experience, where you're at. So remember that when you're looking at text messages, ask for clarification. But that's a good example for that. So now, you got the package, right? And now you go right into decoding, which means you have to go through my package and pull everything out. Okay? You have to take everything out, put it out, what you're doing right now. You're taking my sentences, you're breaking apart, you're comparing them to things you've heard, maybe an article you'd read, and you're kind of making it all make sense. And then we get to, this is the funny part. I always thought this was out of order too. Decoding happens before you. So the thought comes from me and gets encoded and shipped out. But you have to decode it first before you even process it. So the part of your brain that's tearing it apart isn't necessarily, you're not looking at it objectively yet, because it hasn't gotten your memory. It hasn't processed who I am, and whether or not you think I'm credible, or whether or not you even want to hear this information. All that happens after you've already encoded. And when you're decoding, sometimes you pick what you want. And sometimes you'll see something very emotional in that box. You open the box, for instance, you gotta be really careful when you get upset to use vulgarity, because it's such an emotionally charged approach. And if I open up the box and I see an F-bomb in there, I'm gonna pick it up and, whoa, you said this? And it's like the whole box is full of really good information that would explain why you swore, but no, I'm looking right at this, because that caught my attention. Or, did you just insult me? You know, like we pick things out, and then that's what the argument ends up turning into one word you used. And then you've got feedback. So that's an example of if you don't get good feedback on Amazon. So it's the reviews, right? If your packages always end up like that, but no one ever said anything, you wouldn't change it, right? You would never know that something is happening between you sending it and getting it. That's why, as a listener, you gotta get feedback. Because sometimes we feel like when we're trying to be polite, or we don't want to offend, or we're at a networking event, we just, it's not worth it. But if you don't go, hey, by the way, when you say that word, it offends everybody. Everybody here mentioned it earlier when you were in the bathroom, but that's a bad, that's just, don't talk like that. But some people, they can go through all their life and just never get good feedback, or they don't listen to the feedback, right? We know people like that. So what can go wrong with this process? Again, there's so many different things. You've got memories, you've got experiences, and one of the things, emotional vocabulary is huge right now. There's a lot of research going into this for business stuff, because if you were never taught the words that associate with certain feelings, because you're a man raised in the United States and feelings are the worst possible thing you could ever experience, you can't explain what's going on. You can't do it, because you don't have the words. Just like a child can't say, I noticed when I go outside that the sun hurts my eyes. Right? That's an advanced, I've made this correlation. The sun is hot and it's got UV rays and it's hurting my eyes. They just go, ah! And you're just like, stop it. It's like, no, and you're like, no, stop. And you're like, they don't have words. They're like, I don't know what the word is for this, but it sucks. Like, whatever makes this stop. And that's the thing too with language with kids, right? Little kids don't use language like we do. They use sounds that have results. So if a little 4-year-old walks up to you and goes, hey, I love you, can I have a cookie? You're like, oh wow, you're so smart. Like, no, they just know that if they make those noises in that order, cookie shows up. They don't know what a cookie is. They don't understand the process of making cookies. They don't care. They're like, hey, what's that little, they go to their friends, right? They're like in the playground, like, hey, what's that little circle thing? The little black stuff? I think the sound is cookie. Like, all right, I'm gonna go make that sound. See, because that's the thing. Human beings are hilariously prone to doing what works. I give this example a lot. If I was at my office and I was walking out of my office and I kicked the desk and I would yell the F word, right? And my uncle comes running in, he's like, hey, are you okay? I'm like, oh, I just hurt my foot. He just hands me a check for $1,000, like, you'll be all right, leave. I'm like, what did that? So then I hit my foot and I wait. I'm like, okay, it's not that. And then I yell the F word, he comes in, I'm like, I'm an adult. But if I just walk around my office cussing and it results in money, you're not gonna wanna be around me. It's just like, it's gonna trigger in my head like, wow, this actually works. Like, ooh, okay. And sometimes that happens. And a lot of times, it's just a correlation. It's not a causation. You're just like, oh, hey, when I say this word, people laugh, so I'm gonna keep saying that word. And then I get off the stage and I'm like, oh, I probably should have checked my zipper, right? Like, I thought I was just funny, whoops. But we do that. We play these little games in our head and make these correlations. So what the basic idea of all this is just let you know that speaking, communicating with other human beings is extremely complex. And this is the mentality I get from people when I try to explain this to them. I said what I said, I don't care how they heard it. Well, as we've seen, it could very well be what you said and how you said it. And men, when you hear a woman say, it's not what you said, it's how you said it, there's a lot behind that, you know, because it's not to divide men and women, but women are more likely to be attuned with their emotions. And when a guy goes, yeah, I love you, and you're like, they might not think that, because in their head, they're picturing themselves like Fabio, right? As they turn, their hair blows back, and they're like, I love you. And that's what happened. That's what I pictured happening. Like, wait, what did you see? And I guess I just haven't learned how to express that. And so we got it, and that's why you give the feedback then, not 2 weeks later when now you're explaining them while we're not talking, right? So this one here is really important too. It only takes one bad communication. I mean, is anybody here, just a show of hands, because it's happened to me, where you've lost a relationship with somebody over one conversation? Because that's the thing. People can completely rewrite their memory of you to that moment. So all the communication after that will get filtered through that. And it's really easy to do. I mean, there's so many different things like, oh, really? That's great. Oh, really? That's great. Like that is a slight change in my pitch of voice. But if you don't like me, and you think you have a negative feeling about me that you just assume I'm brazen or cocky, you will hear what you want to. You will see what you want to. Because the human eye can't actually see streaming video, which a lot of people don't know. That's why 4K TVs cause so many troubles with people, because it's actually higher than the refresh rate of the human eye. So if you watch my hand and you see that blur, it's because your brain is animating. It's doing this, really. It's taking pictures, but it's assuming that I'm moving. Just like you assume my facial expression. So when you look at somebody, let's say you insult somebody on accident, and they go like this, like, whoa, what was that? You may see this, right? It's a very slight change from like confused to angry. And if you think that's an angry person, you have an assumption about them already, you'll see angry, and then you'll react in kind, and they'll react in kind, and then all of a sudden you're actually mad at each other. Because self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So I don't want to just end it with doom and gloom, but these are some of the best listening skills that you can employ, right? And I'll come over here so I can actually read them. So, we've got pay attention. You guys I can tell for the most part, you're paying attention. And luckily, because of my eyes, the ones that aren't, don't distract me, because I can't tell. I just assume everybody's looking up here, so I'm having a good time, right? But it's really important. What does pay attention mean? We assume it means looking at the person. But if you're looking at them, and you ever heard of thought chambering, right? Let's say that there's a barrel, like a gun, and that's your consciousness, right? And somebody is feeding information through it. If you chamber a thought, you are not listening, because you're waiting for your turn to speak, which happens a lot. Because, that reminds me of this other thing, and and you see people do that, like, you're like, okay, you're not gonna hear me. So, one of the things, I had somebody contact my office recently, and they said, look, I don't know if this makes sense to you, but we have too many chefs in the kitchen at my company. I was like, I totally get it. And he's like, we've got 4 owners, and they never agree. And we just spend the whole time arguing. I was like, well, try this. It's something you do with family training. Everybody gets a pad of paper, and you set a timer, just like a chess game. And as soon as that timer goes off, you get to talk. And everybody else, they have to write it down. But you only have 5 minutes, so by the time it gets to your turn, you have to decide. Do I spend 5 minutes telling him what he said was wrong, or should I give my opinion? And you'll see people go, you know what? You see that, like, yeah, and especially if somebody's going to address it already. And so stuff like that adds to paying attention. Yes, those thoughts are going to pop in your head. Yes, you're going to have random distracting ideas, so just write them down. Then we have withhold judgment. This is the hardest one. And I had to learn this while doing therapy, because I can't react emotionally to a child telling me something traumatic, right? And that's one of the hardest things I had to learn was do not assume somebody else's emotion. And the very first case I got when I was doing my practicum was a little kid. He's an 8-year-old boy. And I was like, hey man, how was your summer? He's like, well, my grandma died. And my first instinct was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, oh man, like that must have been so rough. But I remembered my training. They're like, don't assume how he feels, let him tell you. So I was just like, were you guys close? And he's like, no, she lived in Germany, I didn't really know her. I'm like, well, what else did you do? He's like, oh, I played a bunch of games, right? And the reason that's important is because if I had apologized, oh my gosh, that must be so hard, his little brain's gonna be like, oh, I didn't think it was that bad, I didn't really know her. Maybe I should. I should be sad. That's my grandma. You know, he goes down this whole, and we get that. People come up to you and like, oh, you know, I had cancer last summer, or I got sick. And we oh man, instead of just being like, yeah, it's rough. And it sounds cold-hearted to do that, but let the other person express their emotions. Don't give it to them. Don't make it about you. That's pretty much what's happening. We feel fearful because it involves our remembering, oh crap, I'm mortal. I totally forgot about that. Like, I thought another 300 years left. And then you've got the reflect. So reflecting is really important too, because if you say back to somebody what they said to you, one, watch their face. Like when you're doing consulting, for instance, like, man, you know, I really feel like the products that we're developing just aren't selling well. Oh, really? Like, well, why do you think that the products that you're developing don't sell well? You'll see people go, and it's just this, they heard me. Like, that's it. I just said back what they said. Plus, they can be like, well, that's not what I said. It gives them that chance to realize that they were just speaking, because a lot of times we're just talking. And sometimes we're taking it, like I said, complex emotions and turning them into verbal communication. And if we don't ask for that reflection, we're just assuming they said it right. But that doesn't, if they're emotional, if they're upset, if they're worried about their company, if they're worried about their marriage, don't assume that they're packaging they're putting that package together perfectly, because that's the best chance for them to make that mistake. And then we've got clarify, which goes with that, summarize, and then share. So you want to clarify after reflecting. Reflecting just means say it back. Be a mirror, not a self-help book. One of the best advice I've gotten was from another dad. Because my daughter's 19 going on 20, and she's been trying to, she comes to me and tells me all these things that are going on with her life, and my first instinct is, well, let's fix it. And she's like, well, I kind of want to do it myself. And so I started doing this thing where she comes to me and my son, like, Dad, I got to tell you something. Before you go, do you want my advice, or do you want me to listen? And if they say listen, trust me, it is one of the most relaxing feelings to be like, cool, you don't want my advice. And what's funny is by the time I get to the end of the conversation, they'll be like, actually, I do kind of want your advice. But the good news is, I was listening so well because I wasn't chambering an idea. We chamber these ideas, and then okay, whatever you were saying, I heard the first 3 seconds of it, so I obviously understand what you're saying, right? Like, and that's what happens. You open the package, you pull one thing out, like, oh, I get it. And one of the things, if you think about Amazon, right? What if Amazon had whatever you call it, policy? That if you open the package different than what the other person had packaged it, it just ruined everything. It just had like paint cans in it that would blow up like when you steal money, right? Which would be impossible, because think about it, when you pack, what happens to the first thing that goes in? It's the last thing to come out, right? Language is the same way. The first words you said, it's piling up, and then if people can have this thing called a recency or a primacy effect. They either remember the first couple things you said or the last couple things you said, especially if they're stressed or you're in an argument. They're going to hear part of it. And you can tell them 50 words, but in the middle of it, you hear, you're dumb. I don't care what else you said, you called me dumb. And that's what we're talking about now. We're shifting the topic to this time. So what happens is you end up with a big sentence, and you pull out a part, and you argue about that, and you pull out a part, and you argue about that, and then you're like, what were we talking about? Like 30 sentences ago? Like, I don't know, I'm just mad now. I just want to yell at somebody now. And so, as you go through it, you end up with sharing, right? That's when you talk about yourself. Get to that point first. That's why the listening is important. And it's not just hearing, because hearing happens. You do not control hearing. If I do that, you can't decide whether or not you hear me do that. You are not in control of those little hairs we talked about. That is another human fallacy that we have, is that we think, oh, well, I'm controlling my ears. Like, no, your ears are just feeding information. You're deciding what to listen to. And that's the control that you have, as to what am I actually going to let come in. And this is a really good example that I give a lot. I have a friend of mine, he had a new girlfriend. They invited me over to the house. And while we're all sitting there talking, they brought up a political conversation, which is always a great idea, right? Like, politics and religion, if you ever want to clear out a party, just lead with that, right? So, long story short, they started talking about a specific political thing. And I go, hey, you know what's interesting about that? And I was giving a historical context. I wasn't even talking about my opinion at all. I was just talking about where that political thing came from, because I like history and how humans think. And his girlfriend turns to me and is like, well, if you think that, and you think that men can do this and blah, 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 and I'm just like, oh, clearly there's a misunderstanding. And so I'm like, you know what, not worth it. One of the best advice I ever got, the best advice I've ever heard about how to live a good life is to never argue with a fool. And I'm not trying to insult her, but where she was at the time, because when you get mad, you lose about 20 to 30 points of IQ. So anybody who's mad is a fool. It's not worth it. You're not going to win the argument. You can't win an argument. You can win debates, but you can never win an argument. It's just a waste of time. So I'm like, okay. So I let it calm down, but we're trying to play a card game, and I can just feel her burning in my, just that. So I just put the cards down, and I turn and say, do you think I believe this? And she's just like, you could see that, like, people don't do that. We don't ask for clarification. I was like, do you believe I believe this political stance? And she's like, well, I'm like, let me finish my original sentence. I was just giving you historical context. And she was like, I'm so sorry, like, I don't know. And I'm like, I know what happened. You heard one word. It could be, healthcare. It could be immigration. It could be abortion. Any of those words, boom, trigger goes up. And you're like, this guy believes this. Where is it? Where is it? See, there's some evidence? Okay. And there's all these words, you're like, that's all I need. Done. That's why you shouldn't talk about stuff on Facebook. It was for share cat videos, and we've ruined it. Just stop. You're not going to post an article that says the way you think is stupid, and someone's going to be like, God, you're right. I'm a complete moron. I thank goodness Dr. Phil had this conversation, or they're not reading it. Facebook isn't even showing it to them. I actually had to have this conversation because I've got a friend on the right, friend on the left, and I put their Facebooks on their laptops next to each other, and I was like, find your evidence. And I gave them each other's laptops, and they couldn't find it because Facebook only shows you're right, you're wrong. No, it's you're right, you're right. That's how it's designed. It's not designed to show you information that will go against what you believe. It's just not. It's an algorithm. It's not anything but that. That's what's so rough about today's world, is that we walk around with these blocks, these filters, and as soon as we hear a trigger word, I know what you believe. I know what you believe because of your shirt or because of the car you drive. So I'm just going to look, and I'll take 100 words, and all I need is 3 to prove I'm right. That's all we're trying to do, is prove that we're correct. We have a little hypothesis about people, and we don't let them talk. So that's basically the crux of it, is that imagine you're shipping stuff. And if somebody comes to you and they're like, hey, you said something that hurt my feelings, stop for a second, pull the emotion side aside and be like, maybe my package got messed up along the way. Maybe it got lost in transit. Maybe it never made it. And it's really important in any field you do. And like I said, my things I like to work with is business, parenting, and teaching. They are all identical processes because it's one brain trying to get another brain to do something it doesn't want to do. Right? I mean, in the end, that's what is happening. So, thank you guys so much. I appreciate your time.
So in my haste to bring Jeremy up here, one of the things I didn't tell you is that on your table are some cards and some pens. And so the way that we do this is if you have a question, please write it down, hold your hand up, and one of our volunteers will come and grab that from you, and you can anonymously ask a question. And it's been amazing over the years to see what happens when you can anonymously ask a question, right? So one of the things while you guys are doing that, you have given us so many nuggets, Jeremy, and we have a room full of parents. Yes? Any parents in the room? Right? So can we take this information back and apply it with our families? And we have business owners with employees, right? So I'm going to speak to that for just a minute. And I know that you've done a lot of consulting work. And so the question, like, what's the most common communication error that you see when you work with businesses, and how, I mean, like just that one little tip that you gave about, everybody's trying to, their brains, they're chambering thoughts and they're not letting it all out, right? So just sitting down at the table and working through that with them. So what are some of the other tips that you can give for businesses to help when you recognize that there's a communication problem?
One of the biggest issues is that culture. Any business I go into, owners are seen a certain way, managers are seen a certain way, and employees are seen a certain way from each person. So if you're a manager, your employees are lazy and your owner doesn't listen to you. If you're an owner, everyone's lazy. If you're an employee, you're not appreciated and everybody's mean. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but that's what's happening. And the thing is, this is what I hear the most. And it's funny because I saw it in the schools too. The first school I went to, I interviewed every grade level and asked them what the problem was, and they all said admin. I was like, well, okay. And I talked to the admins, what's the problem? The teachers. And I see the same thing. This is the problem. You will hear people say, well, my employees don't listen to me, and they don't follow my directions, and they're lazy. And I'm like, well, what did they say when you tell them that? Like, I'm not going to tell them that. Why? It's like, because they're not going to do it anyway. Right? And then you talk to the employees, and they're like, well, we don't get paid enough, we don't get time off, the boss doesn't listen. I'm like, well, what did they say when you said that to them? I'm not going to tell them that. Why? Well, they're not going to listen anyway. So we got two people, two polar opposites, they're going there like, there's no even point talking about it. And they won't. So you got 10, 15 years, no one says anything, and then one person gets mad because they let it build up, and then it turns into an argument, and they leave. And so when they leave, when the employee leaves, the owner mind goes, see, those are the kind of people, see, when people stand up for themselves, that's a problem. So it reinforces it. It gets worse and worse. If you don't have a way of having open channels of communication, people aren't going to say anything. Because there's a lot of, there is people, is that right? There are people who enjoy the employee experience. And that's something I also tell my owners. They're like, I just wish everybody thought like me. And I'm like, then you wouldn't have employees, you'd have competition. And he's like, what? And I'm like, if everyone in your office was an owner, they would steal from you. Like, I'm not saying that they would steal from you, but they would eventually leave and start a company. Because they don't want to work for you. They're like, well, I guess that makes sense. Like, yeah, it's good to have people who are like, you know what, honestly, I'd rather just be told what to do effectively and just tell me what my job is. But a lot of the times, this is an activity I do with one of my business partners. We interview the owner about what they think everyone's doing, and then we interview the people on what they think they're doing, and then we compare it, and it's rarely the same thing. Like, oh yeah, Susan, she answers my phones and she does some QuickBooks stuff, and that's about it. And then you talk to Susan, it's like 7 pages of, like, she's doing a lot more than I think you know. They're like, oh my goodness. And it's like, and she ever answer the phones. So if you're answering the phones and doing bookkeeping, that means you're never caught up on bookkeeping. Because that's something I have to tell people too, is that the brain handles social skills and analytical skills separately. And on average, it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to get back on an analytical task if you're interrupted by a social one. So if you're doing bookkeeping and you have to answer the phone and talk to somebody and do small talk, you just lost an hour. And that's why it's like, you shouldn't have that person doing the same thing. The problem is, big problem with communication, it's the way we've always done it, right? And I hear that argument a lot, and I'm like, why don't we live in caves? So we did that for a while, right? I mean, why do we have AC? I mean, we used to just adapt to the environment. Like, well, we don't want to go that far back, right? We want to go back to maybe the late 80s. That's when we're going to hold things into place forever. But there's a software company I work with. It's actually, funny enough, developed by the guy who built Facebook. So it's a task management software. I'm sure you guys have seen these. But their slogan, which is really important, even if you don't use software, is that they want to help people find out who's doing what by when. Those are the 3 biggest gaps that a lot of companies have. Who's going to do it? Well, I thought he was going to do it. Well, why didn't you check? It's not my job. You know, like, and people get into these, and what's funny is I hear all these people all the time in these smaller companies who are like, well, that's not my job. And I'm like, well, can I see your job description? Like, oh, I never had one. I'm like, then your job's whatever you're asked to do, right? Like, you don't have a assigned job description, then how can you say that's not your job? And vice versa, how can you say this is my job? And the best time to handle a miscommunication is the minute it's happening. Because you could say, before you go, the way you said that, or do you have an issue, or do we have a problem? Which, yeah, I know, terrifying, right? It's made my life so much easier. I just say it right up front, like, hey, what did you mean by that? Just say, you just said this, right? And a lot of times people are like, oh no, I didn't say that, cool. Now I'd have to spend 2 weeks thinking about it and ruminating over it, being like, did they mean it by this, or this, or this, or this? And that's what our brain does. Rumination means to chew over. And rumination is one of the most deadly things in the United States because your brain gets stuck. You can get somebody who's rude to you at a Walgreens and it lasts 3 months. I should have done this, I should have done this, I should have stood up for myself, I should have, and it's this should stuff, right? You ever heard that term, don't should on yourself? It gets your attention, but think about it. We do it all the time. But that's, again, if we don't get to the communication soon, it'll fester. That's all I gotta say, is if you don't handle those problems early, they do get worse. So.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? I didn't see any cards go up. That must mean you are an excellent communicator. Thank you so much. You guys give him one more round of applause.